This week marks the 20th anniversary of the Virtual Boy, Nintendo's first console misfire. While generally used as the butt of the joke, I have a soft spot for this unusual portable. Perhaps it has something to do with the way I was introduced to the system. You see, I was at the North American unveiling of the Virtual Boy. It may have been 20 years ago, but I remember the whole thing like it was yesterday. It's the winter of 1995, and I'm a junior in high school, attending the Consumer Electronics Show for the third time. Despite being closed to anybody under the age of 18, I was able to sneak in all 3 times with little more than a doctored birth certificate, a high school newspaper press pass, and an impeccably maintained goatee. These were the days before nosy convention staffers could easily verify facts on the internet. So it wasn't like I had to hire Ocean's 11 to pull off the scheme. By this point, I was a seasoned pro. I knew where to go, who to see, and what to expect. This was the year that both the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation would launch. Plus, there was already rumbling of Nintendo's brand new 64-bit Super System. I expected the kind of pomp and circumstance that would make my pimple-faced buddies at home jealous. Instead, I got the video game equivalent of blue balls. It turns out that neither Sony nor Sega were ready to show off their 32-bitters in any large capacity, instead leaving that for the first ever Electronic Entertainment Expo a few months later. But Nintendo was different. They promised brand new hardware for the winter CES. Would Project Reality make an appearance? Would Nintendo show off a new Game Boy? No, instead they opted to introduce the United States to the Virtual Boy. This was not the first time Nintendo showed off their non-handheld eye-killer. Months earlier, the company shocked the world with its unveiling at the Shoshinkai Software Exhibition. But news moved slowly in 1994, and none of the magazines of the day were able to explain it in a way that made sense to my 16-year-old brain. Without screenshots and hands-on previews, it was hard for me to get a grip of Nintendo's newest console. But who am I to doubt Nintendo? Up until this time, they had produced some of my favorite games and consoles. What's more, the prospect of having a new portable from the creator of the Game Boy was simply too much for my teenage body to resist. I would have spent all 3 days standing in line if I had to. That's how committed I was to seeing what promised to be a mind-blowing experience. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait 3 days to see it, but it certainly felt like I did. The slow-moving line stretched around Nintendo's booth, showing pictures and models to hint at what we were about to see. Everybody around me was on pins and needles, intrigued by what could possibly be on the other side of that door. All we knew was that there was only enough room for a dozen people at a time, barely enough to keep the line moving. As we neared the door, an attractive woman handed out the press packets and welcomed us to the Virtual Boy display. We were about to see the next generation of portable video games. We were led into a dark room full of Virtual Boy kiosks. Each system had its own game, complete with a quick glance guide showing off the buttons and other useful information. We each sunk our heads into the goggles, as if we were getting ready to sink a battleship. What met me on the other side was a simple pinball game full of eye-piercing 3D effects. After a few minutes, I was ready to try the next game, a boxing game full of giant robots. I bounced between the different titles, trying to get a sense of what the system had to offer. A few minutes later, we were rushed out of the booth to make room for the next crowd of unsuspecting suckers. As I pulled my eyes away from the screen for the last time, I was met with an uneasy feeling and a migraine headache. It felt like a flashbang grenade had gone off as the Nintendo staff opened up the door leading out to the convention hall. My eyes barely had enough time to adjust as I stumbled through the crowd like a drunken oaf looking for cover. I rubbed my eyes and stood away from the booth, desperately trying to digest what had just happened to me. I regained my composure and looked around. It was easy to tell who the Virtual Boy survivors were. They all had dazed and confused looks. Well, all except for one guy, who broke the silence by blurting out the single most honest comment I've ever heard at a game convention. Wait, this thing's $200? $200? Oh, fuck that! In my head, he received a well-deserved slow clap, but I'm sure that's just me embellishing what happened 20 years ago. Ah, fuck that. that was the sentiment shared by pretty much everybody who spent the day waiting in line to see the Virtual Boy. I went away disillusioned, rightly concerned about the future of Nintendo. And I wasn't alone. Next Generation magazine called the American debut baffling. Die Hard Game Fan, Electronic Gaming Monthly, and even GamePro were all dumbfounded by the experience, simultaneously underwhelmed and at a loss for how to cover this massive fail. This was the last major video game debut held at the Consumer Electronics Show, after Nintendo packed up their geodesic dome and Virtual Boy displays. They officially pulled out of the Consumer Electronics Show and became a big champion of E3. Only a few months later, Sega would make everybody forget about the Virtual Boy debacle by announcing the surprise launch of the 32-bit Saturn. Eventually, the Virtual Boy came out, but a high price and poor sales doomed the system from the go. These days, Nintendo never talks about the Virtual Boy, even when it's completely relevant. Sometimes I wonder if that man ever bought the Virtual Boy. I did, but certainly not at the $180 asking price. To this day, I still think of that guy's outbursts, always associating it with Nintendo's bad decisions. The Wii not in HD? Ah, fuck that. You can't use more than one Wii U controller on the same system? Ah, fuck that. You're seriously gonna try to sell me a gimmicky 3D system that gives me headaches again? Oh, fuck that. Hey, thanks for listening to me talk about the Virtual Boy. It's hard to believe this little guy turns 20 this week. Do you own a Virtual Boy? If so, did you buy it at launch? I'm not sure I've ever actually met anybody that bought it at launch. I'm pretty sure I picked mine up at $50 on clearance. Anyway, we'll be back soon with a bunch of new reviews, so make sure and hit the subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.